This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Erik Spanberg, in for Mike Collins. Today we're taking a closer look at Charlotte's transit. What's working, what's not, and where the estimated $6 to $8 billion needed to build out the system might come from. At the same time, the city streetcar expansion, now under construction, won't open as planned next year, and the existing streetcar route will be closing this summer for at least 6 months. These challenges and more fall to John Lewis, the CEO of Charlotte Area Transit System, known as CATS. John Lewis is with me today in studio. Welcome to Charlotte Talks, John.
Good morning, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Well, good morning. As we were talking off air just a few moments ago, there is a lot going on in transit right now, and it becomes complicated in a hurry because you have these various funding sources, you have different transportation modes. So I want to start with the big picture, which is much of what's under discussion right now revolves around the 2030 plan and transit lines that, generally speaking, go northwest and southeast. In layman's terms, what are the main projects and where would they go?
Sure. So this region made a very affirmative, took a very affirmative stance on public transit back in 1998 when we passed the half-cent sales tax. And as a result of that, we greatly expanded bus service, but we also planned rapid rail corridors along 5 general corridors. You know, the Blue Line has been in operations. We opened that, the South Corridor, in 2007. We opened the extension to UNC Charlotte just 1 year ago, March of last year. The Gold Line, which was funded by the city, opened its first segment in 2015, and we're under construction for phase 2 right now. But as a part of that overall plan, there was also the Red Line, which would connect uptown Charlotte to the towns of Cornelius, Huntersville, and Davidson. That corridor has been established for a number of years. We're having some interesting conversations with the owner of that corridor, Norfolk Southern Railroad, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yes.
But then there's also the Silver Line. Now, the Silver Line originally started as the corridor was Matthews to Uptown. And then the last corridor was uptown to the airport. But as we finished our study of the West Corridor last year, it made sense when we lined up the preferred alternative for that it ought to be just an extension of the Silver Line. So the Silver Line is now a one contiguous corridor from Matthews to uptown to the airport and beyond. Okay,
so that's a summary of what's going on when we talk about the 2030 plan. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, you've estimated $6 to $8 billion. Those numbers obviously would have to be fleshed out, and you have engineering, but that's kind of a loose estimate. So let's start maybe as we dig into this. The Silver Line you mentioned now recommend to run from Matthews along Independence, and then you go along Uptown and you go west to the airport. So one of the big sticking points here has been whether to tunnel under Uptown to connect more directly as you take this route from Matthews into Uptown and then you go to the west, or as has been recommended and approved, I think, by the Metropolitan Transit Commission, you would skirt along Uptown and then go to Gateway, right, and then go out. So let's hear first from Ron Tober, your predecessor. He was with CATS originally in 1999 when it was formed. Here's what he had to say about the idea of not using the tunnel.
It's remote from the center of downtown and certainly remote from the southern portions of the existing downtown area.
And then there's a group called Sustain Charlotte, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Shannon Benz. They have been vocal about this as well. Here's what Shannon Benz had to say about the routing of the Silver Line.
We've actually spoken to a number of people who have said that sort of getting dropped off on the edge of Uptown is not near as attractive as being dropped off in the heart of Uptown.
So you've heard these criticisms before, but what's the general response from CATS about why not to do the tunnel?
Sure. There are a number of factors. Let me say first, I have a great deal of respect for Ron Tober. Without Ron Tober, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today, and we wouldn't have built the Blue Line. And Shannon and Sustain Charlotte, we have a great working relationship, and we will continue to do so. I think we all have the same goal of providing the best system of mobility options that we can for the citizens of Charlotte in this region, but in this area we clearly disagree. I think what the most common mistake that people make when they're thinking of public transit is they think that this is only about work commuters. And when you think about the choices that we had in regard to the Silver Line, we start in Matthews, a suburban community where a lot of people live in the suburbs and work in and around the uptown area. But when you look at the average number of trips per household, depending on size, is generally each day between 8 and 12 trips. You know, smaller households around that 7 or 8, larger households around that 12 or more. But if you're only going to focus on commuters, which people tend to make that mistake, then that means I'm only I am only competing for 2 trips a day, that morning trip in to work and that afternoon trip back, which is great. But what public transit is about and what our mission is not just about providing mobility options, but also supporting the economic development and other goals of this city. And so if we make the mistake of focusing only on commuters, we're only going to go after those 2 trips. When you look at our overall system and you compare what our ridership is along our route, and I love this story and I tell it a lot. When Ron Tober built the first Blue Line, the station at the convention center, now Stonewall, was only going to be originally a part-time station, only there for big conventions, and we were going to shut down all other times. Now, when I first got here 3.5 years ago, the area along Stonewall was a bunch of surface parking lots and dirt mounds. And now look at it. It is the most densely populated urban development probably in the city of Charlotte. And it is one of our highest ridership stations. There's not one parking space there. And I get back to that commuting, how many trips each household takes. So if we focus on a commuter, we're going to compete for 2 trips. But when you look at stations like Stonewall and like 36th Street and East-West, where there are no parking spaces, we're able to compete for all 8 or all 12 of those trips. So I get the work trips to and from work. I get the grocery trips. I can compete for the restaurant trips. I can compete for just the daily, I'm going to go out and see what's going on in the city. I can compete for every trip in that household. And that's why there's so much residential development along the Blue Line, why so many people are moving into and around there, because they want to use transit as a part of all of their trips. And so when you look at our urban stations, they outnumber in terms of ridership our suburban stations. So if we want to make that mistake of only planning for commuting riders, we're going to have a problem with ridership. And if we look at the one lesson that I would take from the tragedy that happened in Raleigh-Durham with the killing of their rail system, cost effectiveness was a big issue of it. And so we're going to focus on one subset of ridership, and then we're going to spend a couple extra $1 billion.
I was going to say the estimates, I think, $1 to $1.5 billion,
yeah.
right, for a tunnel?
It just doesn't make sense. It almost puts me to the point where I wonder if some people are trying to kill our project by moving us and putting focus on, inefficient, ineffective, and high-cost options in that. We want to support the goals of the city. We're going to support economic development. The area around 11th Street is underdeveloped at this point, is a fantastic opportunity for growth, and also will serve the areas that the private sector, the banking community, and others have donated property for affordable housing. We want to build a line for the city of the future, not the city of 10 years ago.
That is the voice of John Lewis. He is the CEO of CATS, and we're talking about transit today on Charlotte Talks. I want to ask you, you mentioned price and cost is such a big part of this conversation. How concerned are you about making millions of dollars of additional investments at a time when the Blue Line extension has missed its projections for ridership by a third, give or take, for much of its first year?
Well, I think when you look at there were very ambitious ridership goals set 10, 12 years ago when we first went into competition for federal funding. But when you look at the actuality of our ridership, we're averaging about 28,000. I think if I remember correctly, the estimated projected numbers after year one were about 36. So we have fallen short in that regard. But there are also some other mitigating circumstances involved in that. 36th Street, even though the station was open, access to 36th Street Station was impacted because the roadway didn't open until October. We opened the rail station in March, but the roadway connection didn't open until October. Sugar Creek, same issue. NCDOT highway project just opened 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so we're missing some of the opportunities there because of other projects that are going on. I think when our ridership continues to grow, and I think we'll ultimately meet or exceed that. I also wanted to remember when we hosted big events, the NCAA tournament, ACC tournament, and the NBA All-Star Game. I mean, our ridership over that weekend was beyond imagination. I think on that Friday, even though many uptown businesses encourage their employees to telework or just take the day off, we were over 38,000 riders on that day. And that's without the normal commuting. On Saturday, our normal ridership is around 12 to 15. We were at 18,000 riders. And on Sunday, our normal ridership is about 10. We were upwards of 15. And so there's definitely, you can see that latent demand. People know that the best way to get around this city is using public transit, particularly for large events like that.
Another part of the 2030 plan, as you mentioned, is commuter service to the north. So for years, for people who have not been following this, there has been planning for what is known as the Red Line, a train that would have gone 30 miles between Uptown and Mooresville. And the problem, as you mentioned, is that the tracks are Norfolk Southern's, and Norfolk Southern refuses to share those tracks, or at least they have so far. So I know you're talking about bus rapid transit in the interim, but what do you think the ultimate chances are that a commuter rail line is up and running at some point between Uptown and Mooresville?
Well, I think there's always the opportunity for ongoing discussions and negotiations. We have to remember Norfolk Southern is a Class 1 railroad. It's a private business entity, and they are in the business of making smart decisions for their shareholders and for their business partners. And I understand and we respect that. What we want to focus on is how do we make a win-win situation for both. We work very well with Norfolk Southern on the Blue Line, on the Silver Line, as we're getting into development of the Gateway Station. They're very good partners. And so it's about making good business decisions on their part and us finding that win-win. I think we will continue to have conversations with Norfolk Southern and other partners involved in that discussion. North Carolina Railroad, which Norfolk Southern runs the vast majority of its service through this region on their railroad. And so it's more of a three-party discussion than just between CATS and Norfolk Southern. And those conversations continue to move forward. In the meantime, we've got to provide solutions to people stuck in gridlock along that I-77 corridor. And so with the opening of the managed lanes, we're going to provide very robust express service and moving towards bus rapid transit, where there are parking rides along the corridor that have direct connects into the bus lane, so we can take advantage of our biggest goal, and that's reliable transportation service.
That's the voice of John Lewis. We're going to pick up the conversation on the transit lines. Stay with us here on Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Northeastern University, where the goal is for students and faculty to use experience to ignite learning and discovery. Locations in Boston, Seattle, Toronto, and in Charlotte. northeastern.edu/experience. And Blue Ridge Music Center's 2019 Summer Concert Series featuring Mandolin Orange, Kruger Brothers, Chatham County Line, and more. Saturday evenings, Blue Ridge Parkway, near Galax, Virginia. More at blueridgemusiccenter.org. Tomorrow on Charlotte Talks, we meet the winners of WFAE's very first Queen City Pod Quest. We talk about what makes a good Charlotte podcast and more. Then we'll go over the latest trends in technology and bring you up to speed on headlines in tech. That's tomorrow morning on Charlotte Talks at 9, here on 90.7 WFAE.
Four-day school weeks are becoming more common. Districts across the country are saving money by adopting shorter weeks, and studies suggest students are happier and their grades don't suffer. But isn't this a challenge for working parents? The true cost of cutting class, next time on 1A.
1A coming up from 10 to noon, right after Charlotte Talks, here on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
Back on Charlotte Talks with Erik Spanberg, in for Mike Collins, and my guest today is John Lewis, who is the CEO of CATS, and we're talking about the 2030 plan, among other projects that he is working on. So let's wrap up in terms of the 2030 plan with I wanted to ask you about the existing line, the Blue Line, and the Blue Line extension, which run about 19, 20 miles. Do I have that right? 18 miles?
18 miles.
18 miles, okay. Which go from 485 to UNC Charlotte, of course. And now there's conversation about taking it south to Pineville and out to Ballantyne. What's the prognosis for that?
Sure. And so we're embarking on that study to extend the Blue Line from Pineville to Ballantyne. Anybody who lives, works, or plays in that area knows the challenges with congestion and growing population and all of the issues that come around a very strong economic center like Ballantyne has with mobility. But I want to go back to our original conversation about the Silver Line and again, to caution against short-sighted goals of building for what people think this city is today rather than what it will be in 10 years. Remember, many of your listeners may remember, our original Blue Line was supposed to be from Pineville into downtown Charlotte. And the elected leaders of Pineville at that time said, essentially, we're good, we don't need this, take it from 485. Well, imagine if they had thought about Pineville of the future rather than Pineville of the moment, and they would have probably made a different decision. And so now, 10 years later, literally 10 years later, the different group of officials, different circumstances, different economic realities in Pineville have led them to reconsider that decision. And so once again, I want to say we ought to remember that we're thinking about and we're building towards the city, the region of the future, not the region of today and the past. So we're excited to work with our partners in Pineville. Again, that study is about a 4 to maybe 5 mile extension of the Blue Line, and that kicks off. And we have
does that take you all the way to Ballantyne, John?
All the way into Ballantyne, and we're in the midst of our public meetings over the next couple of months, and I encourage anyone who lives or works in the area to go to our website, ridetransit.org, and take a look at the schedule. We'd love to have your input on this exciting project.
You mentioned, John, thinking about the future. Daniel on Facebook asks, what's the status of extending the rail all the way to downtown Gastonia, which that would branch off from the Silver Line,
From the
correct?
Silver Line. And so right now we have had incredible conversations with our partners in Belmont and Gastonia. Remember, the 2030 plan is a Mecklenburg County plan. And as we were exploring what was the correct corridor alignment for serving the airport and beyond, we heard very clearly from those towns, Belmont, please include us. Come hear what the citizens of Gaston County and Belmont and Gastonia are asking for. And our largest public meeting was in that region. 250 plus people came out to show their support for rapid rail transit. And so we've extended our study across the river into Gaston County, potentially to Belmont. But at the end of the day, we got to get down into how do we fund that extension? Because the half-cent sales tax that funds CATS and will fund these projects are only established in Mecklenburg County.
And that's a perfect segue to what I was going to ask you about next, which is money. This always comes up. So you've said back of the napkin estimate is $6 to $8 billion for the major projects that you just outlined, not going to Belmont and Gastonia.
Not going to Belmont and Gastonia or Pineville to Ballantyne.
But we're talking about moving north, obviously between Uptown and Mooresville with a bus rapid transit service. You're talking about the Silver Line that would take you from Matthews all the way to the airport. Did I leave one out?
No.
No, those two. Okay. So, as you mentioned, we have an existing half-cent sales tax. It's already at capacity. It's generating about $100 million a year right now. The state funding is uncertain. In the past, the state has paid 25% of the big light rail projects, and then the federal picture is even murkier. So what are a couple of your options when you look at funding?
So, number one, when we come up with that $6 to $8 billion range, I want to make sure everyone understands that that is back of the napkin. We haven't gotten into engineering. We've funded in this year's CATS budget to begin going to 15% design, and so we'll continue to hone down on that cost. But that is the cost per mile of the Blue Line extension was about $125 million. When you add up all the miles, and as the crow flies, you get to that $6 to $8 billion range. A lot more work to go in that. But when we're talking about the funding opportunities that we have, number one, we've got to get a clearer picture out of Washington, D.C. Without infrastructure, without a strong federal partner, just doesn't work anywhere. And
Which the federal government paid.
Highways, airports, whatever.
I was going to just interrupt you for a second. For people who don't know, 50% of the of both the Lynx line and then the Blue Line extension, 50% of both of those projects came from the federal government. Go ahead.
You're absolutely right. And continuing on that formula, so 50% federal participation. Both projects were 25% state and 25% local. The state has ebbed and flowed in their conversation. It went from 25% down to $500,000 for a little while, then back up to 10%. I'm so excited that conversation continues. Just last week, the House passed in Raleigh a language in the budget that eliminated that 10% cap. And I'll take the moment to give a shameless plug to Representative Torbett, who is a strong leader in that, has always been a strong advocate for public transit.
From Gaston County,
From Gaston County, interestingly enough. And so we may have, once again, a 25% partner in the state. So that is why we're pushing so hard to move these projects forward so that we can position ourselves here in Charlotte to be ready for as the stars start to align and we get a clearer picture that we're ready to move. At the end, we've got to figure out our local share. And as you mentioned before, the half-cent sales tax is bringing about $110 million a year. It is not enough to meet that 2030 deadline that we've established. And so we have to have a very frank conversation with this community. Does this remain a priority? And if so, are you willing to add additional funding to get us to that 2030 deadline?
So on the local piece, two things I'm wondering about. First is, as you well know, Arts and Science Council has asked the county, which has the right to add up to a half cent to the existing sales tax. They've asked for that to be done, and the Arts and Science Council would take $20 million. It would generate $50 million, so there'd be $30 million for the county to figure out how they want to spend that. CATS have any interest in that, talking about that in any way to help with transit funding?
Sure. I think we have to be careful that we don't overreach in that regard. And so the Arts Council has done fantastic work in this area, and I don't want to muddy the water in that regard. And so they're going after having a great conversation in the community. They're going after their funding. There are other opportunities for us. I think, once again, we're not at the point to have that conversation with the community yet, so we'll let those conversations go in their own path. Regionally, Gaston County and some of our other union and others still have capacity for transportation sales tax. There's a 1/4 cent that is of capacity that is out there that would not require state ratification. So we have options regionally, but also locally that we can take advantage of.
And so obviously one of the things that you want to do is build that momentum so that you can expand into some of these adjacent counties and not only have the transportation capacity, but also have the funding capacity for them to help pay for these things.
Sure. At the end of the day, it's going to get down to how we pay for it. And so I think what CATS has done an incredible job from 2007 on for delivering and being good stewards of the public dollar. We opened a $1.2 billion extension of the Blue Line to UNCC Charlotte last year on time and on budget. We are working to extend the Gold Line right now, Phase 2. We will deliver that on time and on budget also. And then we have the Gateway Station, which is under construction right now. The infrastructure portion of that, the bridges and rail extensions are being constructed right now. We're working to pretty soon bring in a private development partner. I do infrastructure, I understand that well, but vertical development, I got to bring experts in to do that. And so we are just continue to rack up wins in terms of mobility for this community. And I think when we go to the voters of Mecklenburg County with whatever proposal that we put forward, we have a track record of success.
Again, that's John Lewis. He is the CEO of the Charlotte Area Transit System, and we're talking about all things transit. You referenced earlier the failed project in the Triangle, which it was an 18-mile light rail line that would have connected Durham and Chapel Hill. The price tag was about $2.7 billion, would have included roughly $1.25 billion from the federal government if everything panned out. In March, it fell apart in part because of some reservations by Duke University. There were also some state government hang-ups. What lessons do you think can be drawn from what happened in the Triangle?
Well, I think two big ones. Number one, the importance of partnerships. And I don't understand, or I'm not intricately involved in the conversations in Raleigh and Durham and what led Duke to change its mind. But I'll tell you, we have fantastic private sector and public sector partners here. I have the best university in the world at UNC Charlotte and the best chancellor in the world in Chancellor Dubois. Without their partnership, the Blue Line extension would not have happened. And so partnerships are so important there. And the other thing that we talked about is the cost effectiveness. One thing in hindsight, and hindsight is always 20/20, I think this region made a incredibly smart decision when they segmented the Blue Line. We delivered a 9-mile south end, again, with phenomenal success, both from a ridership cost and development, economic development. And so there was no conversation in the community about should we continue to do this. It was can you deliver? And when we embarked on the second phase to build the Blue Line extension to UNC Charlotte, you didn't have those discussions over whether or not we should still be doing this. Is where are the stations, what is the alignment, and how fast can you get it done? And so I think when we're again talking about the Silver Line, one of the things that the lessons that we learned from the Raleigh-Durham was perhaps they bit off a little too much in that initial phase, and cost effectiveness was a huge portion of it. The federal government was continuing to require them to add more and more funding, local funding for contingency. And so when you start adding all of these nice bells and whistles to it, there's a cost associated to it, and it weakens you in the federal process from a competitiveness standpoint.
I want to ask you, we talk a lot about development when we talk about transit. Joel Kotkin, who is a national expert on cities, was here a week or two ago, and he was critical in part about transit maybe serving developers too well, in some cases better than residents. But I want to get your perspective on that, but I also want to hear your explanation of value capture, which is something you talk about a lot. I think CATS has estimated something like $2.7 billion worth of development along the first light rail line, and then $800 million underway or in the planning for the Blue Line extension? So I know that was a long question, but if you can tackle both the development aspect and then also if you pursue value capture, what would that do for you from a funding perspective?
Sure. So I think it is an exciting and a great opportunity for us, not only as a mobility agency, but also as a city and region. So, depending on who you think, numbers you hear, continue to hear from the chamber and others that 60 plus people each day are moving into the city, somewhere over 110 into the region each and every day. We are a destination that people want to reside in. That's why people are coming here. We are a growing city. And with the growing city and growing region comes the growing pains of becoming a major city. And so congestion is one of those. But at the same time, Charlotte has done a great job being proactive in recognizing a lot of people are moving here, economic development is following, and so how do we drive that in a smart way that allows us to continue to maintain the high quality of life that has driven people to come here? And mobility is an important part of that. And so I think this region has been very intentional and very smart in where we put our rail corridors, where we put our mobility options, and how we design for that. We've got an incredible new planning director in Taiwo Jaiova, who is, we've just passed our TOD development ordinance, and we continue to move forward with smart planning and development. And so as we continue to build these corridors and design for these corridors, the economic development aspect of it is very clear. You mentioned the 2.7 in South End and close to $1 billion in the extension. One thing that I will agree is we've kind of let developers off a little easy. They're gaining all of the benefits from our public investment. Now it's time to find a way through value capture to bring some of that additional revenue back into the system. And so $2.7 billion in new development on the south end. There has been additional property tax that comes into the region as a result of that. Should not some of that come back to the golden goose that laid the egg so that we can build the other corridors? That is the conversation that we're going. How do we capture some of the value that we are supporting with our public investment so that we can continue to feed this system? You
mentioned the new Charlotte Plan Director. He will be on this program on Thursday with Mike, so you can hear more about what he's thinking on this value capture, John. Are we talking about an additional tax, or are we talking about taking a portion of the existing taxes and dedicating it to transit?
So it is. We're not talking about new taxes in this regard, but we're recognizing the increased value. And so when we lay down a rail corridor and you have a baseline of a particular property now is worth $100, and we put in rail infrastructure, and now that property is worth $150. There is additional property tax that comes into the region as a result of that. My argument to City Council and to other government officials is that incremental value probably should come back to CATS because we were what drove that, so we can continue to build out the rest of the system. So what we are looking for is a portion. Again, I want 100%, but we'll see somewhere between 0 and 100, I'm sure we'll get. But a portion of that incremental value revenue that comes into the city and the county perhaps should be redirected towards funding public transit.
And I think I've seen you quoted in the past saying that while that would help, that will not solve all the funding problems. So any guesstimate, and I know it's a range, but what are we talking about in terms of what it could do?
It is, again, we're trying to diversify our funding portfolio. Even our estimates are over the next 10 years for the Blue Line, that'll bring in somewhere between $30 and $40 million.
$30 and $40 million. Okay. We need to tap the brakes one more time. When we come back, we're going to talk about the streetcar, and we're also going to get into the main part of your business, which are buses. Stay with us. We're talking with John Lewis. He is the CEO of CATS, and you're listening to Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support comes from WFAE members and Greater Charlotte Oral and Facial Surgery, committed to reversing the opioid epidemic, offering opioid-free oral surgery and safe medicine disposal. Locations in Pineville, Steel Creek, Indian Land, and Gastonia. GreaterCharlotteOralSurgery.com. And the British International School of Charlotte, recognizing the talents of all learners from 18 months to 18 years with a personalized international education and the IB Diploma Program, bischarlotte.org. Coming up at 10 o'clock on 1A, more and more school districts across the U.S. are embracing the 4-day school week. Proponents say the move will help schools cut costs and bolster teacher recruitment, but there's concern that a 4-day school week is tough on low-income families who rely on meals and childcare embedded in a school day. Joshua Johnson and his guests will talk about the true cost of cutting class around the country. That's on 1A, coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock. Here on 90.7 WFAE.
For over 40 years, the stories on Morning Edition have been your stories, your lives, your world.
I saw this man who was.
Think I'll be okay?
But suddenly I hear this cute game.
I sat with him on the couch.
This is where, I've been able to come and hang out.
And the sound of Morning Edition, it's the sound of you. Listen to Morning Edition every day from NPR News.
Tune in weekday mornings from 5 to 9 on WFAE.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins, and my guest in studio today is John Lewis. He is the CEO of Charlotte Area Transit System. We're talking about the 2030 plan. I mentioned right before the break, I want to talk a little bit about the streetcar and also bus service. I think transit gets so much attention, or light rail gets so much attention, that people lose track or lose sight of the fact that buses still are the dominant mode of transportation, not just in Charlotte, but in, I think, pretty much every city in the United States. So, so when we talk about buses, there's a website, transitcenter.org, had mentioned Charlotte's ridership since 2013 is down almost 40%, one of the higher declines in the country. I know you have been not just tinkering, but overhauling the bus route system. So put into context for us how concerned you are with that drop, because that is obviously a big number, and also how you think the steps that you're taking can mitigate some of that.
Sure, and that's a great question, because it's a challenge that every transit system is facing throughout this country, particularly major systems. And so what we're facing is a multi-dimensional challenge. Number one, we talked earlier about the rapid growth that we're having, and so let's just face it, we're seeing a demographic shift in our country. Part of it is age-related. You have the baby boomers who are living longer, who are well prepared for that next phase in life, remaining active, are changing careers or volunteering, doing all kinds of new things. They are one of the largest demographic cohorts in this nation right now. So just in terms of numbers, you have baby boomers who had 2 or 3 kids, lived in the suburbs. Now their kids are out of the home, and they're moving back into cities to take advantage of all the great things from entertainment to culture and healthcare that cities have to offer. Take that on the other side of that demographic age wave is the millennials, that younger group that wants to live, work, and play in areas. They don't want cars. My oldest daughter's 21 years old. She didn't get her license until she was 20, and I had to threaten her in order to do that. So they have a different mindset. But when you take those two demographics, they outnumber every other demographic in the country. And so policy is going to be driven based upon the needs and interests of those two groups, very divergent needs and interests. But one thing that brings them together is they love urban areas. It's cool to live in cities. And when you're talking about what is driving the incredible rise in housing costs in this city and in others, it is because of that. Mm-hmm. And so what the impact that is having on transit is we have an influx of people who are not transit dependent. They want to live along transit. We talked about the incredible development along the Blue Line. They're choosing that, but they're not transit dependent riders. They make choices based on where their destination is, than what mode of transportation.
So they may have cars, or they may take Uber.
Cars, Uber, they have all the gamut of mobility options. So what is happening is our transit dependent population heretofore, which is in the past has concentrated in urban areas, are now being dispersed. And so it is harder to provide transit options for them. And that's what drove us to redesign our system. So our old bus system, which recognized that people lived in the suburbs. And we brought them into Center City. We had lots of mobility options, bus routes in Center City with high frequency. Transit-dependent people could go to any bus stop on any corner and get where they're going. Well, now they're moving further and further out into the suburbs. And so if there are transit options, then there are options that are on 45-minute or an hour headways. The Transit Center also did a study that said in Charlotte, if you had to take more than one bus to get from your origin to your destination, your average trip was 90 minutes. You can get places,
right,
but 90 minutes. I mean, you're spending
to get to
3
work.
to 4 hours a day
right.
just on the bus. So we scrapped that entire system. We went from a hub and spoke to more of a grid system where people can get across county without having to come into Uptown. That started to reverse the trend. Back in September, October, our bus ridership was down 17, 18%. Just last month, it was in the 10, 11, 10.8. So still not great, but we're reversing the trend. The next phase and the last phase and what we've got to start investing in is frequency. Again, while there may be a bus stop, if you miss that bus stop and have to stand at that bus stop, if you miss that bus and have to stand at that bus stop for an hour before the next one comes, you've got some thoughts about the effectiveness of our system. And so the MTC, in this budget, added another $1 million of service so that we can start bringing that 90-minute average trip down to 60, down to 45, down to 30. Ultimately, and it'll take about $35 million investment, there should be no bus route in our system outside of Express that is greater than 30 minutes.
And John, I think what you're talking about there is where we've seen success. The pockets have been Seattle and Houston, I think Detroit as well. They've really ramped up the frequency of the service, so you don't feel vulnerable if you go. I don't mean from a safety perspective. I mean, you don't feel vulnerable that you're going to have to stand there for an hour. You're pretty confident a bus will come.
Absolutely. Time is our most precious resource, and people make decisions based on time. And it's interesting, we look at a number of the developments along the corridor. There's one on at our 36th Street station that has a transportation lounge in it, and they have monitors that say, here's the bus route, here's the rail time when the next one, and here's where the closest Uber or Lyfts or others are. And so people make decisions based on what is going to get me to my destination the quickest and the most effective.
Now, there are a number of topics I wanted to get to, so we're going to play a little speed round of Jeopardy here. I want to get your thoughts on scooters, because I know that's not a CATS project, but it is obviously a big part of transportation conversation, certainly in the past year. What do you think about scooters and safety and how they fit into everything?
I think scooters are an incredible asset to our overall mobility system. If someone's to ask me 10 years from now, what if I could wave my magic wand? What would be the number one thing that CATS could do to show its importance in this community? And that is for us to become seen more as a mobility concierge, or providing mobility as a service. And so whatever your transportation needs outside of the individual car, you could come to CATS and find, I'm at point A, I want to get to point B, and we can seamlessly plan out, and you can pay for that system, whether it's starting in a TNC, an Uber or Lyft, getting on board the train, getting off the train, and getting on board a dockless bike or a scooter. These transportation networking companies and these other mobility options have widened our net of capabilities. Because that person who gets off our train or gets off the bus and figures, I'd love to take that mobility, but my destination is a half mile away. I don't want to walk. It's July. It's 90 degrees out. But if there's a scooter, a Lyft there, or another option, it makes their ride a lot easier, and they're more likely to utilize it.
Again, that's the voice of John Lewis. He is the CEO of CATS. Let's talk about the streetcar. You have had a couple of setbacks. The Republican National Convention coming to town next summer, in part, has delayed the opening from August 2020. There were also issues with the Hawthorne Street Bridge. So I want you to address that, and also just the general notion of the streetcar being built 10 miles. Is that ultimately what you think happens?
Yeah. I think a couple of things in terms of the delay. Anytime we do infrastructure projects of this nature, there are going to be challenges, and the Hawthorne Bridge is a glaring challenge. But the great thing about that, and we're working with the contractor, is we have opportunities to reschedule, and we're rescheduling and resequencing. That bridge reconstruction of that will begin sometime late summer, early fall.
The contractor made the wrong size girders, right?
Contractor made the wrong size girders and didn't work. So there's a big hole in that area. But in the meantime, what we've done is the contractor is resequenced and is doing other work now that they would have done later in the project. And so there's lots of rail being laid through Uptown. I apologize to everyone who has to travel along that corridor. It's a mess. But we continue to work through that. Then you mentioned the big opportunity of the RNC. This project started, the Gold Line Phase 2 started in 2015. We received the grant in early 16. We let the project late 16. And then in 2018, we started talking about the Republican National Convention. And that's a great opportunity for us. It just so happens that project runs right next to the Spectrum Center, and it's 2 blocks from the Convention Center. And there are legitimate, important security needs when you're talking about hosting the presidential convention. And so there will be a security envelope in Uptown, that there will be no activity, no construction, no other activity. And that was right at the time we would have been testing the Gold Line. And so just like we did with the Blue Line extension in December, January, and February before we opened, people saw lots of empty trains running up and down Trade Street. That would have been the point in the project where we would have been during the convention. We don't know how long just yet that security blanket will be thrown over the city, but we have to prepare for it. And so we will stop testing and restart testing once that we're enabled to go back into it. So we had to ask for an extension.
Likely opening date for that phase is?
We are conservatively looking at early 2021, January, February, but I'm a betting man, we'll beat that.
Okay. And then the other piece with the streetcar, the existing 1.5 miles, you're going to close that this summer for 6 to 8 months because you have to raise to raise the platforms, right, for the new.
And so part of that resequencing was going to be one of the last things we did, was to shut down Phase 1 so that we could raise the platforms. We're moving from the old style trolleys to modern streetcar, and so our new streetcars will look just like the cars on the Blue Line. They will be light rail like vehicles. They're hybrid technology, so we'll go off line in the center of Uptown. But we're resequencing, we're bringing that back so that the contractor can continue to keep moving. We are going to have to raise the platforms so that they will be flush with the new vehicles. And we're going to do that a little earlier than we originally planned.
We have a listener email want to run by you. It says, what should one do when the fare stations on the Lynx line do not work?
Well, that is why we have invested in our mobile payment app. So I would encourage people, and it is growing every day. Almost a third of our daily transactions are happening on our mobile payment. So the easiest way to pay on any of our service, bus or rail, is to if you have a smartphone, download our CATS payment app, our CATS Pass app. You can pay on your phone and then activate that pass when you get on board the bus or the rail. Just get away from the ticket vending machines 100%.
Jimmy on Twitter has a question for you, John. He says, when are they going to take, I think he means cats, when are they going to take into consideration the citizens of Mint Hill, Matthews, Waxhaw, et cetera? Aren't they paying for light rail that has no use for them?
Well, they're paying for a transportation system that includes bus. Then we have lots of bus passengers in each of those areas. But we're working hard to deliver the rail options that people are looking for. When we started this discussion in 2002, the half-cent sales tax was enough to build all 5 lines. Then we had the Great Recession that put a real damper in our financial plan. We lost about $3 billion in capacity during that. Now we're trying to jumpstart and do that. That's why I want to do both lines at one time, so that we're not in that conversation of who goes first and building winners and losers. We made a promise in 2002 to have this system built by 2030, and we're going to meet that promise.
I was going to ask you, John, were you here? I'm trying to remember. I was a part of a trip to Denver. Were you here yet?
I was not.
That must have been before you.
No, I was.
Were you
was,
here? Okay,
yes.
okay. So this group, business leaders, political leaders, goes out to Denver, sees the massive expansion of rail, what they've done with their bus station, and since then, Denver's had some issues with ridership on some of their rail, is in areas that are probably lacking in population density, or hurting them a little bit. Their bus system has suffered. How much of a model does Denver remain for Charlotte, given that context?
Well, Denver certainly remains a great model in terms of project delivery. Their program delivered 5 or 6 corridors all at one time. And so in terms of building public-private partnerships and delivering projects, they are certainly a model. And also, interestingly enough, they're having an interesting conversation with Burlington Northern Southern
Seems to be
Railroad
catching, doesn't it?
over the same thing. And so I don't think we could have chosen a better model in terms of how to build out systems. But again, every urban area is trying to figure out the magic potion for dealing with a demographic age wave that is changing literally the makeup of our community.
We're running out of time, but I want to squeeze in one more listener question, which is Robert on Facebook. He says, I guess it's more of a statement than a question, but he says, we need better transit service from Lake Norman to Charlotte. A weekend bus would be nice, for example. What are your thoughts on that?
It's coming. As soon as those toll lanes open, I've got new buses. They're going to be comfortable. They're going to be frequent, and you're going to love it.
And so you answered that so quickly. I do want to ask you one last thing about the North Corridor, which is with the 77 controversy, with what's going on with the Red Line. How hard is it going to be to build support for further transit funding in that corridor, do you think?
Well, I think people clearly want alternatives. They want options. And so we'll begin, as soon as those 77 lanes open, we'll begin with very robust and very frequent and comfortable, reliable service that'll start building that conversation towards funding that rail line as we continue forward.
And for listeners who want more information on this, this is on your CATS homepage, correct? All these projects?
ByTransit.org.
Very good. John Lewis is the CEO of Charlotte Area Transit System. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And as I mentioned, the planning director from the city will be on Thursday. He also has a large role in some of these decisions and some of this strategy, so be sure and catch that. Mike Collins will be back in his trusty chair tomorrow. I'm Erik Spanberg from the Charlotte Business Journal. I appreciate you joining us today on Charlotte Talks on WFAE.